Until more or less a year ago, the Wagner Group was seen as one of the most notorious military organizations on the planet. After the death of its founder, Yevgeny Prigozhin, it largely disappeared from the news. But is the Wagner Group really dead? And if not, where and how did it survive? Good evening, my name is Mateusz Mazzini, and this is Wide the View. Our main story tonight focuses on the Wagner Group. For most of the last decade, it was considered not only a highly professional mercenary unit, but also a primary tool of Vladimir Putin's foreign policy. Although the Russian leader always maintained that the Wagner had no institutional links to the Kremlin, it was obvious that Prigozhin was receiving orders directly from Moscow. But the two men were always bound by a love and hate relationship. And once the government decided to limit its support for Wagner in Ukraine, Prigozhin rebelled. He ordered his men to march on Moscow, demanding ammunition, resources, but most importantly, respect. A year after his death, his legacy lives on, though under many different names. We'll try to tell you that story in our first report tonight.
Yevgeny Prigozhin, also known as Putin's chef, was not the only prominent Wagner executive killed last year. The same plane crash took the life of Dmitry Utkin, a key member of the group's leadership. Most of its rank-and-file members faced a choice. They could either enter the structures of the regular Russian army or continue to be active in the private sector. The Wagner Group as such was never officially dismantled, but its role changed significantly. Independent journalists reported severe backlash against its veterans, some of whom faced prison time in Russia. Their financial privileges stemming from working for a private company were also revoked. But Vladimir Putin was well aware of the usefulness of the Wagner fighters. They were by far the most efficient unit inside the Russian military ecosystem. Their combat experience was extensive and far exceeded that of regular soldiers sent to fight in Ukraine. Russia, lacking high-quality military professionals, could not afford to lose the entire Wagner force. That is why many of them continue to fight, often under various mercenary labels. A key takeaway from the Wagner story is also that the model of private military companies seems to work for Moscow. New organizations have been created, often run by Russian state-owned companies such as Gazprom. Wagner continues to also be active on foreign soil, bringing significant revenue to the Kremlin. Although Putin continues to deny any links with them, Wagner remains his primary foreign policy tool.
What is the Wagner Group without Yevgeny Prigozhin? How does it exert influence in other countries? And does it have now competitors inside the Russian military space? The Wagner Group has always been a little bit of a mystery, but our guests today know its secrets inside out. And I'm pleased to say, joining me tonight are Rafael Parens from the Foreign Policy Research Institute, Tina Dolbaya from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and John Lechner, writer and researcher specializing in the Wagner Group. Good evening and welcome to Wide the View. And I want to begin with you, John, exactly. Let's start with the basics. Yevgeny Prigozhin dies in a plane crash in August of 2023, together with other members of the Wagner Group leadership. What happens next, both for the remains of the group in terms of their military strength, but also politically in terms of their influence, especially within the domestic Russian space?
Well, thank you for having me. I think politically, Wagner very much, through the embodiment of Yevgeny Prigozhin, obviously no longer has a tremendous amount of influence. But I would say the brand of Wagner continues to be something that's salient within especially the Russian military community. in terms of what Wagner's legacy is, it very much depends on the theater in which Wagner was operating. And we should think about, outside of kind of the key leadership of Wagner, guys like Yevgeny Prigozhin and Utkin, for the most part, the men, and it's mostly men who were fighters for Wagner, signed a fixed-term contract, and after that fixed-term contract was over, they could go to any other structure or any other job that they saw fit. So it's better to think of Wagner in some respects as a large contracting firm that was able to provide a lot of men with military capabilities and provide the logistics to get them to the places where they needed to be. In terms of in Ukraine, obviously the men who fought for Wagner are now with a number of different structures, including the Ministry of Defense. There's still a small group of men who are kind of holdouts in Belarus. And in Syria, we don't see Wagner anymore. And in fact, we're seeing kind of a scale down in presence after the fall of Assad. And in Libya and Mali, we've seen a replacement slowly and kind of a half handover in some places like Mali to Africa Corps. And really, it's only in the Central African Republic where Wagner had a significant presence, where we've seen sort of legacy Wagner structures continue to hold out.
We're going to talk about Syria and Africa and other places, of course, in the second part of our discussion. But for now, I wanted to move to you, Raphael, and ask about the broader perspective of inside Russia. So we know some of the fighters from the Wagner Group moved to join the regular army. Some other members joined other PMC's private military companies. But how did the death of Prigozhin in particular, but also the decomposition of the leadership, actually affect the position and the strategy of the regular Russian troops?
Yeah, so part of the issue here is it's very difficult to pin down what is Wagner and what isn't Wagner at this stage. It benefits the organization and the Russian state to sow confusion as relates to this organization, because a lot of the people involved would likely be on sanctions lists. There could be financial impacts, that sort of thing. So we can say that there are likely a few thousand Wagner troops currently coming down from somewhere within the 5 digits at its peak in 2022 and 2023. We do know that Wagner is no longer deployed in Ukraine, which is a fairly big deal for the Russian army and how its operations continue in Ukraine. As we saw in the video earlier, Wagner was one of the most effective units operating in Ukraine, especially during its victory in Bakhmut and in some other places. Although we do know, as John mentioned, that they are currently deployed in Central African Republic and Mali, and less so today in Syria and Libya, where they were deployed previously.
And on that note, I want to introduce you, Tina, to that discussion and ask her to give us sort of a systemic view. Because from the outset, it looks very bizarre from someone sitting in a democratic country. You have a private military contractor that almost appears to be more efficient than your own regular army, but then you've got other actors, like state-owned companies, Gazprom, for instance, that owns its own private sort of military corporations. What does it say about the broader Russian security ecosystem that the most efficient ones are the private units, and private companies or even state companies are actually restored to have their own versions of the Wagner to even maintain security?
Yes, I mean, in Africa, I would say that the security apparatus that Russia managed to develop through Wagner has been very successful, particularly as the previous guests have mentioned in Central African Republic. In Central African Republic now, former Wagner mercenaries, now they are called Africa Corps, right? They have assumed some diplomatic roles as well, have helped the government there to enter in negotiations with Chad. They also want to basically expand through Central African Republic their presence in Africa, and they want to have stationed reportedly up to 10,000 troops in Central African Republic by 2030. That will eventually enable Russia to deploy these troops from this country to other countries in Africa for some temporary operations, for more or for more permanent presence. But obviously, if in the past Wagner Group, Russia would deny its connections to Wagner Group, now this plausible deniability is gone. So obviously now Russia has to be more strategic and less transactional when it comes to its dealings with different countries on the continent, on the African continent.
Well, plausible deniability seems to be on demand for the Russian regime, not necessarily available these days. Thank you very much for these interesting summaries of what has been the fate of the Wagner Group for the last year. But we know, you've mentioned that yourself, that their domestic role has been equally important as their international influence. So now let's take a closer look at the global map of Wagner's activities. A lot of the best Wagner fighters gained experience during Russia's military intervention in Syria. Later, they became active in dozens of African countries and even in Latin America. Officially, they're nothing more than military instructors. But what is their real role abroad? We'll try to give you more details and answer that question in our Rex report.
There are many different estimates about the foreign presence of the Wagner Group. Conservative reports mention at least 20 countries in Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. But media outlets such as the Wall Street Journal say Wagner has a presence in around 40 nations in Africa alone. Their most important area of activity has traditionally been Syria, where 5,000 troops were deployed at the peak of the operation. But over time, African missions became equally important for Prigozhin. Wagner assumed the role of a key security actor in the Central African Republic, gaining significant revenue from its businesses there. The key to understanding the group lies in figuring out its business model. Wagner was rarely paid directly for its services. More often, as in the case of Sudan or the Central African Republic, remuneration came in natural resources. In the latter country, Russian mercenaries were given control over gold and diamond mines and even breweries. Revenue from these business activities was filtered through shell companies and Russian NGOs, often in the Middle East. Wagner veterans remain active in Latin America as well. During a repression campaign following the recent stolen presidential election, Wagner badges were spotted on the streets of Caracas. Nicolás Maduro relied on Russian troops to dismantle the democratic opposition in the country. Whatever their name, private Russian mercenaries continue to be global agents of chaos, and autocracies all over the world are still eager to use their services.
Tina, I want to begin with you now again, because you've been monitoring Wagner's activities in Africa primarily for years now, and we seem to have a lot of conflicting reporting about their presence there. So some more conservative estimates say north of 20 countries that have been spotted in. Wall Street Journal over 2 years ago reported that it was even up to 40 countries perhaps where they were present. Can you settle that for us and actually tell us where Wagner is present in Africa right now?
I mean, that's a great question. And yes, I agree, there's a lot of conflicting data. I guess it just depends if we're talking only about Wagner or if we're talking about other private military companies that Russia has operated across 4 continents.
Try to give us, sorry to be jumping on that, try to give us both. So where's Wagner? Let's talk about Wagner. But if there are any interesting PMCs that we haven't mentioned yet in our discussion, also let's focus on that for a little bit.
I think Wagner or Africa Corps is the most interesting one because I have been the most present on the African continent. I mean, according to CSIS research, so our think tank's research dating back in 2020, in Africa, Wagner specifically has been present in the dozen of countries, but in most cases, this presence was temporary. But there's 4 countries that where this particular PMC was very active, where like Central African Republic that we have discussed, Libya, Sudan, and Mali. And obviously, in most cases, they have supported the local governments. In some cases, they have supported the rebels. It's really dependent on Russia's interest in this particular country, or in the particular sub-region of the continent. As we have mentioned in the first section of the show, it was not that Wagner provided just security services or helped either rebels or the government to counter their opponents, but also in many cases, when it comes to not just geopolitics, but geoeconomics of the Wagner's presence in the region also, they have helped Russia to evade Western sanctions, especially since the start of the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. They have helped Russia with the gold and diamonds that they have mined in Africa, and there are obviously conflicting reporting in that regard as well, but it's estimated that since 2022, through Central African Republic, through Sudan, basically Wagner managed to smuggle 2.5 billion worth of gold to help Russia evade sanctions. So obviously Africa is a very important region for Russia, especially it's a very important part of Russia's global South strategy, generally speaking. I think that it will be in Russia's interest to continue its presence there, especially as we are saying through developing this infrastructure in Central African Republic. However, they will obviously be more careful and not as adventurous as Prigozhin was.
Absolutely. So over to you, John, now, and I wanted to ask you about the nature of the presence of Russian PMCs in Africa, because you've covered their presence, their activities in some of the sub-Saharan countries, if I'm not mistaken. What do they actually do there, and how diversified is the range of their quote-unquote services that they provide there?
Well, I mean, I think we have to remember that Wagner Group is not like any intervention. The Russian interventions have faced obstacles that are similar to any Western intervention in an African country as well. And in many respects, Wagner Group has been a tool of African governments and African elite to pursue their own political projects. And so for that reason, because of African agency, Wagner's operations in each African country have been very different. In Sudan, Wagner was involved, obviously, in gold mining, as has been mentioned, and they offered military instruction to security services. But we've never seen them participate in any sort of offensive operations against one particular group or the other. In the Central African Republic, they initially arrived as military instructors. It wasn't until a new rebel alliance formed and sought to take over Bangui that the mandate that they had switched from one of military instruction to one more similar to Syria, where they were participating in offensive operations. And so
correct me. Sorry to jump in that
again.
Sorry to be jumping on that. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to be a nature of a relationship that you're painting that is entirely clientelistic, that you have a service provider and a client, and then whatever the client demands, the service provider would provide. Is that correct?
Yeah, to a certain extent, of course. And you know, Yevgeny Prigozhin himself, can't forget, was very much a larger-than-life personality who, I think, was motivated very much by the deal. I mean, obviously money and power were important to him as well, but I think he was always motivated to expand into whatever area of business he could. And in some places he was more successful than others because of sort of the way that society and institutions worked in each of those countries. And so they were quite successful after a counteroffensive against rebels to become more involved in the mining sector. In the Central African Republic. I don't think that they were able to make billions of dollars because that's far beyond what CAR's GDP is. But they were certainly more successful than in a place like Mali, which has had long-standing institutions and where they got a lot of pushback in terms of trying to exploit mineral concessions. So it really, their interventions over time tended to follow the patterns of the conflict that pre-existed their arrival, which again speaks to the power too that Africans had in their dealings with Wagner.
And on that note, I want to move to you, Raphael, and actually ask about something we haven't talked about yet, which is the economics of the Wagner presence. How is, or used to be, the Wagner Group getting paid? Because I would believe that's hardly ever direct cash transfers, is it?
So it really depends on the country. In Mali, they were actually paid by the government and continue to be. Whereas in Central African Republic, it's looked more like the exchange of mining concessions and forestry concessions in exchange for their activities, providing military assistance. So a lot of that means that the gold that is being mined there under Wagner supervision is then sent to the United Arab Emirates, where it's broken down and then shipped off to Russia. And that's kind of how they get paid. So it really depends on the country. A similar model was put into place in Sudan as well. Meanwhile, in Syria, Wagner was mostly paid in oil, as has been the case in Libya. So it really depends on the operating environment and what the country that Wagner is cooperating with prefers to do. Although I will note that Wagner definitely prefers the resource extraction route because it can make more money. And it has, frankly, more control over actual activities in the country. Whereas when a country like Mali is paying Wagner, it's much more reliant on the government. It can't kind of do its own thing and continue to operate in the country moving forward.
And very quickly, since you've mentioned Syria, after the fall of the Assad regime, Russia effectively lost its only client state in the Middle East, and Wagner will quite likely no longer operate there. If they're gone from Syria, where do you think are they likely to resurface next?
So the problem with leaving Syria is that it's a major logistics midpoint between Africa and Russia. So it becomes much more difficult for Wagner to be able to send troops and military equipment to its deployments in Africa. So that's one hurdle that it will have to move over kind of moving forward. Although there are some potential operations that Wagner, potentially Africa Corps or other Russian operations could take up across Africa. I would say the top likelihood, at least from my understanding, would be Chad, which has recently removed its alliance with the French, or has at least backed down a little bit. And they have significant military assistance needs and terrorism concerns where the Africa Corps or Wagner could become involved. Togo and Benin are also possibilities. As both of those countries see increases in terrorism.
We will be definitely paying attention to that. I'm afraid this is all we have time for tonight. Raphael Parens, Tina Dolbaya, and John Lechner were our guests tonight. Thank you for being with us. Have a good evening. Yevgeny Prigozhin and other leaders might be dead, but the Wagner Group certainly is not. And it proves to be a useful tool to influence domestic politics on almost every continent. Russian private mercenaries are very good at entering vacuums of power and security. So it's now up to the West to avoid creating those vacuums in the first place. Thank you for being with us tonight. Next week, we invite you for a very special episode of Wider View, in which we will take a look back at what happened in 2024. See you next time, and Happy Christmas.